The OSHA Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response Standard, or HAZWOPER Standard, is a dense and complicated set of regulations that includes several separate mandates for training employees based on the type of workplace, the type of work, and the employee's individual responsibilities. Training under HAZWOPER is required for employees in a range of job roles, all of whom face some elevated risk of exposure to hazardous substances. As we discussed in our recent What is HAZWOPER video, OSHA requires some form of HAZWOPER training for employees involved in three main work activities: emergency response to hazardous substance releases, hazardous substance cleanup, and hazardous waste operations at treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. Based on where you work and what your exact job role is, the training required by OSHA for new employees can vary substantially in the topics covered, the depth and complexity of the material, and of course, the number of hours. In fact, the HAZWOPER standard can require up to 40 hours of training for a new employee. We're going to talk about 40-hour HAZWOPER training in this video, and to do that, we can focus on just one of the three activities covered by the standard, site cleanup. Now, 40 hours of training is a lot of hours. It's a lot of training, so before you dive headfirst into it, you probably want to be sure that 40 hours of training is what you need. Because OSHA does not mandate 40 hours of training for everyone that's covered by the HAZWOPER standard, but the structure and complexity of these regulations can make it hard to decipher exactly how much training OSHA requires for you or your employees. Now, as far as 40-hour OSHA training goes, OSHA requires 40 hours of initial HAZWOPER training for general site workers at hazardous waste cleanup sites, like equipment operators, general laborers, and others involved in hazardous substance removal, and for managers and supervisors at these sites who oversee general site workers or who perform hazardous waste cleanup activities themselves. In addition to the 40 hours of training for general site workers, OSHA requires a minimum of 3 days of field experience for these groups. During those 3 days, the employee must be directly supervised by a trained, experienced supervisor. OSHA also requires managers and supervisors to complete at least 8 additional hours of training on specialized safety and emergency response leadership topics. If you have questions about what kind of cleanup sites are covered by the HAZWOPER regulations, or what substances are hazardous substances, or how these OSHA regulations affect your job, you can find a lot of answers in the free HAZWOPER Training Decision Maker. There's a link to that tool in the video description, and that covers HAZWOPER training requirements for both hazardous waste cleanup sites and responding to emergency releases. Alright, so does everyone who sets foot on one of these hazardous waste cleanup sites need the full 40 hours of HAZWOPER training? No, not everyone. There is a second tier of training in the HAZWOPER regulations for site cleanup for employees who OSHA refers to as occasional site workers. These are workers who come on site, you guessed it, occasionally to perform some specific limited task like land surveying, painting, or groundwater monitoring, and who are unlikely to be exposed to hazardous substances at dangerous levels. OSHA requires 24 hours of initial training for occasional site workers and requires 1 day of supervised field experience. There is one other situation in which OSHA allows the 40-hour HAZWOPER training for employees to be reduced to 24 hours. That's for workers who are on site regularly, but who work in areas that have been monitored and shown to be relatively safe, meaning exposures are below allowed limits, respirators are not needed, and there are no health hazards or possibility of an emergency developing. In case you haven't had enough numbers, here's one more crucial HAZWOPER training rule. OSHA requires annual refresher training for these groups, and refresher training must be 8 hours at least. Now you know who needs 40-hour HAZWOPER training, who doesn't need it, and the field experience requirements for new employees at covered cleanup sites. And hey, it didn't even really take that long, which is great, especially if you have a lot of OSHA-mandated training to get to. Thank you for sticking with me to the end of this video. Visit lion.com/HAZWOPER to try the free HAZWOPER Training Decision Maker and to find a range of courses to help you satisfy OSHA mandates, including 40-hour training for general site workers, 24-hour training for occasional site workers, a 16-hour upgrade course, an 8-hour refresher, and training on additional management and supervisor topics. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.